Hi, I'm Jo from J.H.Leather, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to create a martingale style dog collar. Let's get started. So one of the first things we're going to want is to get our chain. Now this is from Abbey, England, and is solid brass and features 1-inch rings. The other two fittings we're going to need are a buckle and a D-ring. Now, because I have the circle rings on the chain, I've actually dropped down to 3/4 of an inch fittings, and my strap's going to be 3/4 of an inch as well. So the leather we're going to be using for this is 3.5 to 4 mil bridle butt, and the one that I have chosen here is in Conker, and we're going to need a strip to match our fittings, which is 3/4 of an inch for me. And we're also going to need some looping. So I have split this down to just over 2mm thick, and it's 3/8 of an inch wide. So what we're going to do is start by squaring the end on one side of our leather. We're actually going to start with the buckle turn. So we're going to draw that straight across there. And so once we've drawn our line, we can follow that with our knife and square the end and just nick the corners. Okay, so now we've got our strap prepared, we can start to mark out for our turn. So the length of this turn is going to be 2¼ inches that I'm going to be doing on mine. And I'm going to mark in the centre there where that is. Now I'm going to flip that over so the flesh side is facing out and mark 4½. And that's going to be where the turn finishes once we have actually got everything in place. And so we're actually going to loose fit this onto our fittings before we do our edging and staining and all of that, so we can do that in one go. So what we're going to do is start by actually punching our crew hole. So I'm going to help myself out here by giving myself a couple of guidelines to use to make sure I get my crew nice and straight. So the crew I'm going to be using is my 37 crew punch, and the way that I got to that was by holding it up to the tongue of my buckle and just rolling it around, and that looks like it's going to fit nicely. And so if you are unsure of what size to use, what you can do is a test punch first, just to check that your buckle is going to fit nicely. Okay, and then when you're happy you've got your guidelines on and you've chosen your crew hole, you can punch that all the way through. And once you've punched your crew hole out, what you can do is on the back side, use a number 6 edge tool and just take out the back of that crew hole. And that's just going to help our buckle tongue sit nicely in this turn. And you can now fit your buckle on. Now we're going to actually have our turn this way on this collar, looking at something like this. Now the next thing we're going to do is fit our leather onto our circle chain. So we're going to pick one of our loose rings and we're going to pop that onto our leather, like so. And what we're going to do is we're going to work out how long we need our strap to be. So you may need to cut your leather down here if it's a bit unruly, because what we want is to mark our measurements on. So we're going to mark our centre hole and then 2 holes either side, so we've got 5 holes to work with. And we're also going to work out our overall length. We don't want too much flapping around on this side. We are going to have a loop here holding it closed, but really we don't want that to be too long. So I would say for me, my middle hole is going to want to be here. And this is a personal taste thing. You could have this shorter or longer, it's up to you. But I think for me, that's going to be a good size for the middle hole. Because remember, we're going to have 2 holes shorter, so we're going to lose a couple inches or so here. And so for reference, where I'm putting my middle hole, the actual turn here is 5¾ inches. Now what I'm going to do to help myself with this, I'm actually just going to put a bulldog clip over this end, just to hold that all together whilst I work out my overall size. Okay, so for me, I want this to be 18 inches on the middle hole. So I've got my little setup here, holding nicely where the middle hole is going to go. And using a flexible tape measure, I'm going to set this to 18 inches. And I'm actually going to peg that together as well, just to hold everything in place, because we have got a lot of leather going on here. So once we've done that, we can now turn our leather through a little bit more. And this is fiddly, there's no two ways about it. Until you make a few of these and have like your own measurements set out, it is going to be quite a fiddly task. So that being said, let's hold this all together. Let's hook that into there. And you can see I'm slowly working this turn to get it to where I want, and I think that there is going to be a good size we've got going on. Okay, so now I'm happy with the length that I've got. Remember to make sure your chain is at full extension at this point, because if it's closed up, then your collar is going to end up being shorter. And what I'm going to do is mark with my thumbnail the centre of the turn on this end of our ring. You can see that is my centre mark. And I can now take all of this off of our collar. We can now mark out for our turn. So I've got the long end of my leather facing up to the right of me, and I'm going to add 2¼ inches, because that's the measurement we added to our other turn. We can then draw our line straight across and cut along here with our knife. Now, if you wanted to, you could make this into an egg point or a fancier shape if you want. For me, I'm just going to keep this square as it is, and I'm just going to nick the corners. And once we've done that, we can then flip our leather over and mark 4½ inches on the flesh side. And that's going to be the end of our turn, and it also marks where our edging is going to finish. So for the edging, what I'm actually going to be using is my number 3 hollow edge tool on the flesh side, as it takes a little bit more off and it gives it a more rounded finish. So starting on the flesh side, you can see I've got my turn mark here, and that's where we're going to start our edging from. And I'm just going to edge all the way up until we get to our turn mark on the other end of our leather. And we'll do the same on the other side. So starting from where my turn is going to finish, I'm going to take and finish where our turn finishes. On the nice grain side, I'm still going to be using my number 1 edge tool, which is 1mm wide, and it gives a more crisp edge to our work. And then on our nice grain side, we can go all the way around. Now, before we get going with our staining, what we're going to do is finish marking our hole. So I've got my mark here where I want my central hole to be, and then I'm going to add 2 holes either side. So we have 5 in total, and I'm going to do mine 1 inch apart, like so. And finally, before we do our staining, we're going to skive 2 wedges to go either side of our D-ring. And we're going to skive that down to nothing. And we want 2 of these. Now, you don't need to add a D-ring onto your collar if you don't want to. The reason that I am is because in the past I've had customers ask for one so that they can still attach their dog's name tag onto that part of the collar. So the next thing we're going to do is apply some stain to the cut edges of our leather. And then we can burnish the edge with a polishing cloth or wooden slicker. And then once you're done staining, you can then put a crease line on your collar as well as on your leather looping. So you should now have your bits of leather looking like this, and we are now ready to start doing our stitch marking. So starting with our buckle turn, you're going to put your buckle into your turn here, and we're going to mark out onto this long side where we're going to stitch. So we want to get that as close to our buckle as we can, and then also mark where our turn finishes. So we've got 2 marks here. We can then use our chain and do the same on the chain end. So getting our stitching as close to our fitting as possible and marking with our thumb, and also marking the end of the turn as well. We can then use our set square and just transfer those marks onto the other side of our leather. And then with your dividers at their stitching width, you can draw on your stitch lines. Now for me, my stitch line is generally at 3mm or 1/8 of an inch in from the edge of the leather. The next thing to do is do your stitch marking with your chosen marker, and for me I am using my 3.38mm pricking iron. The next thing we can do is even up our holes. Now, although I've only got 5 holes marked on here, you can do more holes if you wish to. Just I prefer 5 holes on my collars. And then you can now punch your holes. I'm using a rotary hole punch for this. And we also need to cut ourselves some looping. So I generally have my loops quite tight. So what I'm going to do is wrap around just one single layer and mark just a little bit longer, just over where the edges touch. And then I stretch my loops out on a looping stick to get them to the size that I need. And so that is our fixed loop. And we're also going to need a running loop. So for this, I use the same method. So I'm going to wrap around the whole strap this time, and this is still just one thickness because, like I said, I'm going to block mine to make it stretch, and then I'm just going to cut it where the edge of the leather is, cut that to length. You can then nick the corners on both ends of this running loop. And now I just got to go and do a bit of extra staining and creasing on this, and then we can get that together. Okay, we're now going to mark our running loop out for stitches. So we're going to hold that on to our collar, just mark where the end meets, and that will be where we stitch mark to. And now when it comes to stitch marking this, we're going to stitch mark all the way through. And what we're going to do is basically put our teeth up to that line that we drew, punch all the way through. And now I had 4 teeth here, so I'm going to put 4 teeth on the other end, and I'm just doing this in the crease line. And we're going to do that on all 4 ends. And we should end up with something that looks a little bit like this. And we can now move on to our skiving. And so starting off our skiving with our running loop, we're going to skive both ends down to half thickness from sort of 1 stitch hole from the end. And then we're going to take this and put some more stain on the ends there. And then on our collar, our 2 turns, we're going to skive down to half thickness as well. And this is about 20 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch in length. Just going to skive down to half thickness on both ends. Like so. Okay, so we're going to start by stitching our running loop together. And so I'm going to be using the single hand stitching method for this, and I'm going to go from the very end hole on one to the very end hole on the other, stitch down through here. Now I do have a whole video all about running loops, which I'll link in the description for you if you are interested in a more in-depth guide on this. And the thread that I am using here is 0.55 millimeter polyester thread. Because this is a dog collar and it's going to be out in the elements, I prefer to use a polyester thread on these because they tend not to get looked after. And when we get to the end, what we're going to do is we'll do a double stitch and then come out between the 2 layers of our loop, and then push the needle through the layers and onto the other side, and then finish stitching this side. And then when we get to the end, we're going to do double stitch over the end, like so. And then to knot it off, what we're going to do is place our needle underneath our stitches. We're going to make a little loop here. And we're going to go back through that loop with our needle. And that's going to create a nice loop there. And then if we go through the loop with our needle, that's going to pull the knot in towards the centre of the loop, and we can now trim that thread off and then put this on a blocking stick. So what I'm going to do is put this loop onto my looping stick here and move that up to, I've got marks on these sticks where I've put them, so that is my running loop mark. So just over there is good. And I'm going to leave that to one side now, being stretched, whilst I do my stitching on my dog collar. So we can now start to assemble our dog collar, and we're going to work first on this turn end and get that all done and fancied up before we do the rest of the collar. So we're going to need our buckle. We can place that onto our strap, making sure we face that the right way, which isn't that way, making sure we put our buckle on the right way around. Like so, and then we can then start to attach our bits into this. So we're going to put our loop in first. So I'm just marking in the centre where that's going to rest, and I can tack that in between the layers. Like so. And when it comes to tacking in when you are around your D-ring, you might find this easier to do over the edge of your desk. And so we are going to be double hand or saddle stitching this collar, and we're going to start with one back stitch, and then to get that turn nice and tight, we're going to do one stitch over the edge as well. and then we'll stitch towards ourselves. And now when we get to our D-ring, we're going to do one long stitch. So we're going to get as close as we can first. And so we're going to skip one stitch hole and do one long stitch. And then, even though this is going to be mostly used as a place for the name tag to go, we are still going to do our long stitch over the edge. And then once we've stitched one side and done our 1.5 back stitches, we can then stitch the other side of this buckle turn. Okay, so when you get towards the end on the other side of your collar, where your loop needs to be stitched in, the best way to do this is to pre-awl all your holes all the way through. And then you can put your loop in. And now when we're awling, we're only going to be awling through the thickness of the loop. So it's not going to get caught in this first one. So I can just stitch that as I would. And then what we can do is awl through, making sure we don't go all the way through our loop. We don't want to do that. And then we can move the loop out of the way whilst we do our stitching. And then when we get to the end here, we can do our last stitch. And then, like the first side, we're going to do one stitch over the edge to get that nice and tight on our buckle. And then we can do a back stitch. And then once you've done your 1.5 back stitches, you can trim your threads, and we're going to do some finishing touches. So we can start by blocking that loop. Put that in our looping stick, and then we can do some finishing touches to the edges here. So we're going to restain. And then on a buckle turn like this, what I like to do is actually use my bone folder to just rub the edges of the leather like so. And get that looking like one piece of leather here. So we can do the same on the other side. And then we can go over this with our creaser. And so when we're creasing, keeping the loop stick in and creasing around our loop. And then on both sides of our turn, because we're not going to be easily able to get to this once the collar is together. So now we've got our buckle turn on, we can start to do some assembly. So the first thing we're going to do is to put our running loop onto our collar. followed by one of the loose rings on our chain. We're then going to go through the loop to the point where we can do our buckle up. So we should have our collar looking like this, and we can now turn our collar, making sure that our chain isn't twisted. We can then bring the other half of our collar around, and we can now tack this turn in place. And again, tacking this end of the collar might be a bit easier if you hang it over the edge of your desk. And really, we only need one tacking here just to hold the leather in place. And we can now stitch this. Now, because this end doesn't have a loop on, to protect this stitch that would go over the edge, we're not going to be doing one on this end of our collar. We will, however, start with one back stitch before stitching the rest of our collar. And then once at the end of our stitching, we can do our back stitches and then stitch the other side of this turn. And so with your turn done, what we can do is do our finishing touches. So we're going to start by restaining that turn. And then using our bone folder, we can just go over that, creating a nice lot of friction on the edges of our leather. And then the final thing is to go over our turn with our creasing iron, just to bring that crease line out once more. We'll do that on both sides. And hopefully you should now have your collar looking like this. And so you have now finished creating a martingale style dog collar. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something new. And if you did, please give it a thumbs up to let YouTube know and to help share this video with other crafters. So thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you in the next video. Hello. Can I help you? Hello. Hey, you're showing off your bling. Showing off Poppy bling. You're just going to have a sleep. It's Grumpy Dog.